The settlement of Portsmouth officially finished the Russo-Japanese conflict of 1904–05. The exchanges occurred in August in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and were facilitated to some degree by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The last understanding was endorsed in September of 1905, and it confirmed the Japanese presence in South Manchuria and Korea and surrendered the southern portion of the island of Sakhalin to Japan. By 1904, Russia and Japan had persevered through quite a while of disagreements regarding control of Manchuria. The Russians had entered the district during the Sino-Japanese conflict of 1894–95 and, alongside Germany and France, was a piece of the triple mediation that constrained Japan to surrender its requests for ports in South Manchuria and the Liaolong promontory following its triumph in China. All things considered, Russia moved into the area and assumed command over Port Arthur, a warm water port with key and business importance. A Japanese endeavor to organize an upset in neighboring Korea was ruined to some degree by the Russian presence in the locale, and the two countries' unique advantages showed up increasingly more liable to conflict. In 1904, the Japanese went after the Russian armada at Port Arthur before the proper statement of war was gotten in Moscow, astonishing the Russian naval force and procuring an early triumph. Throughout the span of the following year, the two powers conflicted in Korea and the Ocean of Japan, with the Japanese scoring huge, yet exorbitant, triumphs. War losses were high on the two sides. At the fight over Mukden, the Russians lost 60,000 officers and the Japanese lost 41,000 troopers. The tactical expenses were high also. A Russian armada made the long outing from the Baltic Ocean around Africa and India, just to be half obliterated by the Japanese upon its appearance in Upper East Asia. By 1905, the mix of these misfortunes and the monetary expense of funding the conflict drove the two nations to look for a finish to the conflict. The Japanese asked U.S. President Roosevelt to arrange a non-aggression treaty, and delegates of the two countries met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905. For keeping up with the overall influence and equivalent financial open door in the locale, Roosevelt favored that the conflict end based on conditions that passed on both Russia and Japan a task to carry out in Upper East China. However, energized by the Japanese military triumphs, Roosevelt stressed over the results to American interests in the event that Japan figured out how to drive Russia out altogether. The discussions focused on admittance to ports and regions in Manchuria and Korea, control of Sakhalin Island, and the subject of who was answerable for paying conflict costs. The central points of the Japanese moderator remembered first control for Korea and South Manchuria, then the exchange of a repayment and control of Sakhalin Island. The Russians needed to keep up with Sakhalin Island, would not pay a conflict costs reimbursement to the Japanese, and wanted to keep up with their armada in the Pacific. The repayment issue, alongside the regulation of Sakhalin Island, were the major staying focuses in the discussion, albeit given its monetary waterways in 1905, Russia was reasonably unfit to pay a reimbursement regardless of whether expected by a settlement to do as such. At the point when exchanges arrived at a stalemate, Roosevelt stepped in with the recommendation that Russia repurchase the northern piece of Sakhalin from Japanese control. The Russians were determined that they wouldn't pay any measure of cash, which would go about as a hidden repayment, when the domain should be theirs. After lengthy inner discussion, Japan in the long run consented to take just the southern portion of the island, with no sort of installment. Theirs had not been a sufficiently definitive triumph to drive the point. The settlement at last gave Japan control of Korea and quite a bit of South Manchuria, including Port Arthur and the rail line that associated it with the remainder of the district. Alongside the southern portion of Sakhalin Island, Russian power was diminished in the locale, however it was not expected to pay Japan's conflict costs. Since neither one of the countries was in serious areas of strength for a situation to proceed with the conflict effectively, both had to think twice about the provisions of the harmony. In any case, the Japanese public felt they had won the conflict, and they believed the absence of a repayment to be an attack. There was a short flare-up of fights and revolting in Tokyo when the conditions of the understanding were disclosed. Essentially, the Russian public were additionally disappointed, irate about surrendering half of Sakhalin. All through the conflict and the harmony talks, American popular assessment to a great extent favored Japan. It were battling a simply battle against Russian hostility, and that the island country was similarly dedicated to the entryway and the regional respectability of China. The American public were restless to help it to trust that the Japanese. This sense didn't actually adjust over the direction of the exchanges, regardless of the best endeavors of the Russian mediator to further develop the press inclusion of his country's situation. A ultimate conclusion of the Japanese to renounce a reimbursement simply reinforced U.S. endorsement of Japan's activities all through the contention. The counter-arrangement and, now and again, hostile to American shows in Tokyo that followed the sanction of the deal surprised numerous Americans. The arrangement of Portsmouth denoted the last genuine occasion in a period of U.S.-Japanese collaboration that started with the Meiji Reclamation in 1868. All things considered, contest between the two countries in the Pacific developed throughout the long term that followed. On the other hand, Japanese relations with Russia worked on following the settlement. Albeit the genuine significance of Roosevelt's intervention and individual tension on the administration in Moscow and Tokyo to the last understanding is muddled, he won the Nobel Harmony Prize for his endeavors in directing the discussions and pushing toward harmony.